Miss Marple and Lady Bantry's last cup of tea. Dear friends, welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, and it's such a pleasure to spend this time with you again tonight. I'd love to hear from you. What is the reason you enjoy listening to these cozy mysteries? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe for new stories every day. Now, shall we begin? Chapter 1. The Call from Gossington Hall. The Morning Post had been unusually dull, Miss Marple reflected as she set down a teacup and gazed through the lace curtains of her sitting-room window. Spring had come early to St. Mary Mead that year, and the village street beyond shimmered with that peculiar golden light that transforms even the most commonplace scene into something rather beautiful. The cherry trees were in full bloom, their petals drifting down like snow onto the pavement, where Mrs. Price was just emerging from the baker's shop with her basket. Miss Marple was considering whether to venture out for a constitutional when the telephone bell shrilled with unexpected urgency. She rose with a slightly careful movement of one whose knees occasionally protested against sudden changes of position, and made her way to the hall. "St. Mary Mead 23, she said into the receiver. The voice that answered was one she knew well, though it sounded strained and oddly formal. "Miss Marple, this is Laura from Gossington Hall." "Good morning." Laura. Miss Marple felt a small flutter of concern. Laura had been butler at Gossington Hall for more than 30 years, and she had never known him to sound quite so peculiar. "Is something the matter?" There was a pause, and when Laura spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm afraid I have very distressing news, Miss Marple. Lady Bantry has passed away quite suddenly this afternoon." For a moment, Miss Marple could not speak. The sitting room seemed to tilt slightly, and she reached out to steady herself against the hall table. "Passed away," she managed at last. "But I saw her only 3 days ago at the church jumble sale. She was in excellent spirits." "Yes, Miss Marple, that is what makes it so very shocking." Her ladyship seemed perfectly well not 10 minutes before it happened. She was taking her afternoon tea in the drawing room as she always did, and then his voice trailed off. Miss Marple's mind, despite the shock and grief that threatened to overwhelm her, began to function with its accustomed clarity. Something in Laura's tone suggested more than mere sorrow. There was unease there, and perhaps something else. Confusion, possibly even fear. "Dr. Haydock has been called, I presume." "Yes, Miss Marple. He's here now. He says it was her heart. Very sudden, very peaceful." "But," Miss Marple prompted gently. Another pause. Longer this time. "I cannot quite explain it, Miss Marple. Perhaps I am being foolish. But there was something not quite right about the whole affair. Nothing I could put my finger on, you understand? Just a feeling." "I understand perfectly, Laura. Feelings are often more reliable than facts, I've always found. They spring from observations we make without quite knowing we have made them." "Yes, Miss Marple. Precisely so. I shall come at once. Has Colonel Bantry been informed?" "The Colonel is traveling in Scotland, Miss Marple. We've sent a telegram. Miss Bantry is expected this evening from London." "I see. Then I shall take the 4:00 bus and come to pay my respects. Lady Bantry was a very dear friend." After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple stood for a long moment in the quiet hallway. Through the open door of the sitting room, she could see the abandoned teacup still half full and the cheerful spring sunshine streaming through the windows. How strange it was that death could come calling on such a beautiful day. How strange, and yet how very usual. Lady Bantry, Dolly Bantry, as she had been in the old days before her marriage to Colonel Arthur Bantry. They had known each other for more than 40 years, ever since the Bantrys had first taken up residence at Gossington Hall. What a vibrant, generous, occasionally impossible woman she had been, so full of life and energy and opinion, and now gone, just like that, during afternoon tea. Miss Marple shook herself slightly and returned to practical matters. She would need her black coat and hat naturally and gloves. Perhaps she should take a small offering of flowers from her garden. The early roses were just beginning to bloom, but even as she moved through these familiar rituals of mourning, her mind kept returning to something Laura had said. Perfectly well not 10 minutes before. And then that strange emphasis on the word feeling. Laura was not a fanciful man. In all the years she had known him, he had never once expressed an opinion that was not founded on solid observation and experience. The bus journey to Gossington Hall took 20 minutes, winding through lanes bordered by hawthorn hedges just coming into flower. Miss Marple sat in her usual seat near the front and exchanged quiet greetings with the conductor, who had heard the news and expressed his condolences with genuine sorrow. Lady Bantry had been well loved in the district. As the bus rounded the final curve and Gossington Hall came into view, Miss Marple felt her heart contract. The house looked exactly as it always had, serene and gracious in its park, with the afternoon sun warming the old stone to honey gold. The gardens were immaculate as always. Tom, the head gardener, took enormous pride in his work. Yet somewhere within those beautiful walls her dear friend lay dead. The bus stopped at the gates, and Miss Marple descended carefully, thanking the conductor. The walk up the drive seemed longer than usual, though perhaps that was merely her imagination, or perhaps it was reluctance. She was not certain she was ready to see Dolly lying still and silent, all that vivid personality extinguished forever. Laura must have been watching for her because the front door opened before she'd even reached the steps. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming so quickly." His face was grave, and she noticed that his hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he took her coat. "Where is she, Laura?" Still in the drawing room, Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock thought it best not to move her until all the necessary formalities had been completed. "He's in the library at present, making telephone calls." "I see. And the rest of the staff?" "Mrs. Dollop, the cook, is in her quarters, quite overcome, as you might imagine. Clara, the housemaid, is the same. It was she who found her ladyship. Young Daisy, the new girl, is helping in the kitchen, and Tom is in the garden. Of course, he doesn't yet know." Miss Marple nodded slowly, filing away each name, each detail. Already her mind was beginning to work in that peculiar way it had, sorting and arranging, looking for patterns. "Perhaps," she said gently, "you might take me to her now." Chapter 2. A Death in the Drawing Room. The drawing room at Gossington Hall had always been Lady Bantry's favorite retreat. Miss Marple had spent many pleasant afternoons there, discussing village affairs over tea and cakes, listening to Dolly's spirited opinions on everything from the state of the rose garden to the latest pronouncements from London. The room faced south, catching the afternoon sun through tall windows that overlooked the terrace and the parkland beyond. Today, those same windows admitted a golden light that seemed almost cruelly cheerful. Lady Bantry sat in her customary armchair beside the fireplace, her head tilted slightly to one side, as though she had merely dozed off after finishing her tea. She wore a dove-gray dress with a lavender scarf at her throat, and her hands rested peacefully in her lap. For a wild moment, Miss Marple half expected her friend to open her eyes and say something characteristically acerbic about the fuss everyone was making. But Lady Bantry's eyes remained closed, and the stillness about her was absolute. Miss Marple stood in the doorway for a long moment, her own hands clasped tightly before her. She was aware of Laura hovering anxiously behind her, and of the oppressive silence that filled the usually lively room. "When exactly did this happen, Laura?" "At approximately 3, Miss Marple. Clara brought in the tea tray at 2:30. Her ladyship was reading the newspaper and seemed in perfectly good health. Clara returned to the kitchen, and when she came back at 4 to collect the tray, she found her ladyship as you see her now." "And Dr. Haydock arrived when?" "I telephoned him immediately. He was here within 15 minutes. Miss Marple moved slowly into the room, her eyes taking in every detail with a careful attention she might have given to a particularly complex piece of embroidery. The silver tea service stood on the low table beside Lady Bantry's chair, gleaming in the afternoon light. It was the good Georgian set that Lady Bantry had inherited from her mother, polished to perfection as always. 2 cups and saucers were arranged on the tray, though only one showed any evidence of use. The other remained pristine, its spoon resting precisely across the saucer in the way that Clara had been trained to arrange them. 2 cups, Laura. Yes, Miss Marple. Her ladyship was expecting a visitor? Indeed. Who was this visitor? Laura's expression became, if possible, even more troubled. That is part of what has been puzzling me, Miss Marple. Her ladyship mentioned to Clara that someone from the charity committee would be calling. But when I asked which committee, Clara could not say, and no one actually saw this visitor arrive or depart. How very curious. Miss Marple moved closer to the tea table, studying it with intense concentration. The silver teapot, the milk jug, the sugar bowl with its delicate lid, the plate of shortbread biscuits, untouched. Everything arranged just so, almost too perfectly arranged, she found herself thinking. May I? She gestured toward the tea things. Of course, Miss Marple. Dr. Haydock has already examined everything. Miss Marple did not touch anything, but bent closer, her keen eyes noting the slight stain in the used cup, the faint mark where Lady Bantry's lipstick had touched the rim. There was something about that mark that struck her as odd, though she could not immediately identify what troubled her. She straightened and turned her attention to Lady Bantry herself. Moving with great gentleness as though fearful of disturbing her friend's rest, Miss Marple approached the armchair. Lady Bantry's face was peaceful, almost serene. But there was a faint discoloration around her lips that Miss Marple noted with growing concern. Dr. Haydock believes it was her heart, she asked quietly. A stroke, Miss Marple. He said it was very quick, very merciful. She would not have suffered. How fortunate, Miss Marple murmured, though her tone suggested she found this conclusion less than entirely satisfactory. And yet, Laura, you said there was something that troubled you about the whole affair. The butler hesitated, clearly struggling with some internal debate about the propriety of voicing his concerns. It is difficult to explain, Miss Marple. Her ladyship was perfectly well when Clara brought the tea. I myself saw her not 20 minutes earlier when I brought in the afternoon post. She was in excellent spirits, laughing about something in the newspaper, and then, so suddenly. Strokes can be very sudden, Miss Marple, she said gently. I have known several cases in the village where death came quite without warning. Yes, Miss Marple, I know that is so. And yet, tea does not pour itself. Laura stared at her. I beg your pardon, Miss Marple. Miss Marple gestured toward the tea table with one gloved hand. Lady Bantry was sitting here alone, you say, after Clara brought in the tray. But someone poured the tea. The cup has been used. If she suffered a stroke so sudden and so severe as to cause immediate death, would she have had time to pour herself a cup? And if she did pour it, why would she have poured 2 cups when she was, by your account, alone at the time? A new voice spoke from the doorway. An excellent question, Miss Marple. I wish I had thought to ask it myself. Dr. Haydock entered the room, his medical bag in hand. He was a man of 60, with iron-gray hair, and the permanently harried expression of a country doctor who had been too long without adequate sleep. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and Miss Marple had always respected his judgment. Dr. Haydock, I'm so very sorry to be meeting you under such circumstances. As am I, Miss Marple. Lady Bantry was a remarkable woman. The village will be much diminished without her. He set down his bag and moved to stand beside the armchair, looking down at his patient with genuine sorrow. I have known her for 30 years, and I never once heard her complain, even when she had every reason to do so. Your diagnosis is a stroke? Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin thoughtfully. It appears to be the most likely explanation. There are certain signs consistent with a cerebrovascular incident, the suddenness of it, the lack of any apparent struggle, and yet, I confess there are area specs that puzzle me, the discoloration around her mouth. The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. You noticed that, did you? Yes, that is one of the things that troubles me. It is not typical of stroke cases. And then there is the matter of the tea itself. Miss Marple waited, knowing that Dr. Haydock would continue in his own time. When I first examined the body, I noticed an unusual smell, very faint, but distinctive. I cannot quite place it, but it reminded me of something from my medical training years ago. From Thea? Miss Marple asked sharply. Possibly, or from Lady Bantry herself. As I said, I cannot be certain. He paused, then added with obvious reluctance. I have taken the liberty of removing the teacup and its contents for further examination. I trust no one will object. On the contrary, Miss Marple said firmly, I think it is very wise of you to do so. Laura had gone rather pale. Are you suggesting, Dr. Haydock, that her ladyship's death was not natural? I am suggesting nothing of the kind, Laura. I'm merely being thorough. In cases of sudden death, it is always prudent to eliminate any possibility of error. But Miss Marple, watching the doctor's face, saw the worry in his eyes, and she knew with the certainty that came from long years of observing human nature that Dr. Haydock suspected something was very wrong indeed. Chapter 3. The Tea Service for Two. The kitchen at Gossington Hall occupied the entire north wing of the house, a vast domain of copper pans and scrubbed deal tables that had been Mrs. Dollop's undisputed territory for the better part of 20 years. When Miss Marple descended the back stairs in the company of Laura, she found the cook seated at the large central table, her face blotchy with weeping, while a young girl with red-rimmed eyes stood at the sink washing teacups with unnecessary vigor. Clara, the housemaid who had discovered Lady Bantry, sat very straight in a chair by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with a sort of neat, composed appearance that spoke of years in good service, but her composure was clearly fragile, maintained only through considerable effort. Clara, Laura said gently, Miss Marple would like to speak with you about this afternoon if you feel able. Clara rose immediately, as though grateful for something to occupy her mind. Of course, Mr. Laura. I will do anything I can to help. Miss Marple smiled at her with warm sympathy. I know this must be terribly distressing for you, my dear. I wonder if we might sit together for a moment. I find these kitchen chairs far more comfortable than the formal furniture upstairs. It was a small kindness, putting the maid at ease, and Clara's rigid posture relaxed slightly as she resumed her seat. Miss Marple settled herself opposite, arranging her skirts with the care of one who understood that unhurried movements often yielded better results than direct interrogation. Now then, Miss Marple began, her tone conversational, Laura tells me that you brought in the tea tray at 2:30. Yes, Miss Marple. Her ladyship always took tea at 3, so I brought the tray in 10 minutes early, as she preferred. She liked to let the tea steep properly, she always said. Very sensible. I'm quite particular about my tea as well, and Lady Bantry was alone when you entered. Yes, Miss Marple, she was reading the Times and seemed quite cheerful. She remarked that the Prime Minister had made another foolish speech, and wasn't it a blessing that we lived in a country where one could say such things without fear? Miss Marple's expression softened. That sounded exactly like Dolly Bantry. And the tea service, you arranged it as usual. Yes, Miss Marple. The Georgian silver, as her ladyship always preferred for afternoon tea. The teapot, milk jug, sugar bowl, and 2 cups. 2 cups? Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Lady Bantry was expecting a visitor. Clara nodded, and now a slight frown appeared on her face. Yes, Miss Marple. She mentioned it when I asked if she would be requiring anything else. She said someone from the charity committee would be calling and I should show them straight in when they arrived. Did she mention which charity committee? No, Miss Marple, and I confess I did not like to ask. Her ladyship seemed a bit distracted, not quite herself, as though she had something on her mind. This was interesting. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. In what way, not quite herself? Clara considered this carefully, clearly wanting to be accurate. She seemed anxious, Miss Marple, not worried exactly, but as though she were preparing herself for something unpleasant, rather like when the vicar's wife comes to discuss the flower roster. And everyone knows there will be disagreement about the Easter lilies. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She knew that particular expression very well indeed. And when you returned to collect the tray at 4, what did you find? Clara's composure wavered, and she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. Her ladyship was sitting in her chair, Miss Marple, exactly as you saw her. At first, I thought she had fallen asleep, which was unusual, as she never napped during the day. But when I spoke to her and she did not respond, I realized something was terribly wrong. The visitor had departed by then. I assumed so, Miss Marple, though I never saw one arrive or leave. I was in the kitchen the entire time after bringing the tea, and young Daisy was with me, learning to prepare the evening vegetables. Neither of us heard the doorbell. How very peculiar, Miss Marple murmured. Could someone have entered through another door, perhaps? The garden door to the morning room was unlocked, Miss Marple. Her ladyship often left it open on fine days, as she enjoyed watching the birds on the terrace. Miss Marple nodded slowly, filing this information away. Then she returned her attention to the tea tray itself. The 2 cups, Clara. When you collected the tray, had both been used? No, Miss Marple, only one. The other was still clean just as I had left it. And the tea-pot, had tea been poured from it? Clara hesitated, clearly trying to remember. I believe so, Miss Marple, though I cannot be certain. I was so shocked by finding her ladyship that I barely noticed such details. Of course, my dear, that is perfectly natural. But tell me, when you arranged the tea tray, did you notice anything unusual about the sugar bowl? This question seemed to surprise Clara. The sugar bowl, Miss Marple? No, I do not believe so. Why do you ask? Oh, it's probably nothing, Miss Marple said dismissively, but her eyes remained sharp and thoughtful. I merely noticed that the lid seemed slightly askew, as though someone had replaced it in haste. I am always very careful about such things, Miss Marple. Her ladyship was particular about the silver being properly arranged. I am quite sure you are, my dear, which is precisely why I found it noteworthy. Miss Marple rose from her chair, moving with that deliberate care that characterized all her actions. She crossed to the large dresser where the tea things were kept and examined the sugar bowl that stood there, freshly washed and dried. Is this the bowl that was used this afternoon? No, Miss Marple. That one is still upstairs on the tray. This is the everyday bowl we use for the servants' tea. I see. And the sugar itself, where is it kept? Clara pointed to a large canister on the shelf. There, Miss Marple. We buy it from the grocer in the village, the same as always. Miss Marple lifted the lid of the canister and peered inside. The sugar lumps were uniform in size and color, each one a perfect white cube. She replaced the lid thoughtfully. Tell me, Clara, when you prepared the tray this afternoon, did you fill the sugar bowl from this canister? Yes, Miss Marple, just as I always do. And you noticed nothing unusual about the sugar itself? Clara shook her head, clearly bewildered by this line of questioning. No, Miss Marple. It was perfectly ordinary sugar. But Miss Marple's expression suggested that she was not entirely convinced. She'd seen something in the drawing room, something that had caught her attention, even amidst the shock and grief of finding her friend dead. One of the sugar lumps in the bowl beside Lady Bantry's chair had been darker than the others, as though it had been dampened and allowed to dry, or perhaps handled with fingers that were not entirely clean. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, the sort of detail that most people would dismiss as meaningless. But Miss Marple had learned over many years of quiet observation that small things were very rarely meaningless, particularly when they appeared in conjunction with sudden death. "Thank you, Clara," she said warmly. "You've been most helpful. I wonder, though, if you might do me one small favor." "Of course, Miss Marple, anything." "When Dr. Haydock has finished with his examination of the tea things, I should very much like to see that sugar bowl again. Would you be so kind as to let me know?" Clara looked puzzled, but nodded her agreement. As Miss Marple climbed the stairs back to the main floor, her mind was already sorting through the facts she had gathered. 2 cups prepared, but only 1 used. A visitor who came and went unseen, and a sugar bowl with its lid slightly askew containing lumps that were not quite uniform in appearance. Small things, yes, but in Miss Marple's experience, murder was very often hidden in the smallest of details. Chapter 4. Whispers about the Will. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead on the 6 o'clock bus, her mind occupied with thoughts that were considerably less peaceful than the evening landscape sliding past the windows. The hedges were thick with May blossom, and the fields beyond showed the fresh green of new growth. It was the sort of evening that ordinarily would have filled her with quiet contentment. But there was nothing ordinary about this evening. By the time she reached her cottage, dusk was settling over the village. She had just removed her hat and gloves when she heard the familiar creak of her garden gate, followed by a determined knock at the door. Miss Hartnell stood on the doorstep, slightly breathless and vibrating with barely suppressed excitement. "My dear Miss Marple, I have only just heard the dreadful news about Lady Bantry. I came at once to see if there was anything I could do." Miss Marple recognized this statement for what it was, a desire for information rather than an offer of assistance. But she was too fond of Miss Hartnell to begrudge the curiosity that was, after all, a perfectly natural human trait. "How kind of you. Do come in. I was just about to make myself a cup of tea." This was not strictly true, but Miss Marple had long ago discovered that tea had a remarkable way of loosening tongues and creating an atmosphere conducive to conversation, and Miss Hartnell, for all her tendency toward gossip, often knew things that were surprisingly useful. Once they were settled in the sitting room with cups of tea and a plate of digestive biscuits, Miss Hartnell leaned forward with an expression of great solemnity. "Such a shock for everyone, and so sudden. They are saying it was her heart. Dr. Haydock believes it may have been a stroke," Miss Marple said carefully. "A stroke? Yes, of course. Though I must say I saw Lady Bantry only last week at the lending library, and she seemed in perfect health, quite vigorous. In fact, she was having a rather animated discussion with Mrs. Price about the new books." Miss Marple sipped her tea and waited. Miss Hartnell would come to the point eventually, and it was always better to allow her to do so in her own time. "Of course," Miss Hartnell continued, lowering her voice slightly, "there has been a great deal of talk in the village about other matters concerning Lady Bantry. Matters which I hardly like to mention at such a time, but which may be relevant indeed. Her will, Miss Marple. Apparently she made some rather unexpected changes quite recently." This was interesting. Miss Marple set down her cup with great care. "How recently?" "Within the last month, I believe. Mrs. Jameson heard it from her daughter who works in Mr. Peters's office. You know Mr. Peters, the solicitor in Much Benham?" "I have had some dealings with his firm." "Yes. Well, according to Mrs. Jameson, Lady Bantry came to his office 3 weeks ago and made significant alterations to her will. Most unexpected alterations." Miss Hartnell paused dramatically, clearly savoring the moment. She left a substantial sum to someone quite outside the family, a Miss Eleanora Cray. The name meant nothing to Miss Marple, though she filed it away with the same careful attention she gave to all new information. How very interesting. Do we know who this Miss Eleanora Cray might be? That is precisely what everyone is wondering. No one in the village has ever heard of her. She's certainly not connected with any of the local charities or committees. Mrs. Jameson's daughter said that Mr. Peters himself seemed quite surprised by the bequest. Miss Marple considered this carefully. A sudden change to one's will, particularly a change that favored a complete stranger, was always worthy of attention. It suggested either a long-hidden connection or some form of obligation or, in less pleasant cases, coercion. I wonder, she said thoughtfully, whether Lady Bantry mentioned this Miss Cray to anyone else, to Colonel Bantry perhaps, or to her daughter. That I cannot say. Though I did hear something rather curious from Miss Weatherby, who heard it from the postmistress. Apparently, Lady Bantry received several letters over the past few weeks, always in the same hand with a London postmark. The postmistress noticed because Lady Bantry seemed quite agitated when she collected them. The postmistress has very keen powers of observation, Miss Marple remarked drily. Miss Hartnell had the grace to look slightly abashed. Yes, well, you know how it is in Avalage. One cannot help but notice things. Indeed, one cannot. And I find that what we notice is often more significant than what we are told. After Miss Hartnell had departed, armed with several pieces of information that Miss Marple had judiciously allowed her to discover, Miss Marple sat for a long time in her chair, watching the last of the daylight fade from the sky. Eleanora Cray. The name circled in her mind like a moth around a candle flame. She was quite certain she'd heard it before many years ago, though she could not immediately recall the context. The following morning, after a night of intermittent sleep, troubled by uneasy dreams, Miss Marple made her way to Much Benham on the 9 o'clock bus. Mr. Peters's office occupied a respectable Georgian building on the High Street, and his clerk showed her into the inner sanctum with the deference due to a lady of good standing, who had moreover been a close friend of one of the firm's most distinguished clients. Mr. Peters himself was a thin, precise man of 60 with silver-rimmed spectacles and the slightly dusty appearance of one who spent his days surrounded by legal documents. He rose to greet Miss Marple with genuine warmth. "Miss Marple, please do sit down. I was deeply saddened to hear of Lady Bantry's passing. Such a remarkable woman. She was indeed. I have known her for many years, and I shall miss her terribly, as will many others, I am sure." Mr. Peters resumed his seat and folded his hands on the desk before him. "I assume this is not merely a social call." "You're very perceptive, Mr. Peters. I hope you will forgive my presumption. But I understand that Lady Bantry made some recent changes to her will." A slight weariness entered Mr. Peters's expression. "You understand, Miss Marple, that I cannot discuss the details of a client's will with anyone outside the family." "Of course. I would not dream of asking you to breach confidentiality, but perhaps you might be willing to confirm certain facts that are already, I fear, becoming common knowledge in the village." Mr. Peters sighed. "The servants talk, I suppose. The servants, the postmistress, the grocer's wife. It is quite impossible to keep anything secret in St. Mary Mead. Very well. What would you like to know? Is it true that Lady Bantry recently made a substantial bequest to someone named Eleanora Cray?" Mr. Peters removed his spectacles and polished them slowly, clearly weighing his response. "It is true that Lady Bantry visited this office 3 weeks ago and made certain amendments to her will. One of those amendments did indeed involve a bequest to a Miss Eleanora Cray of London, a substantial bequest, $10,000. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "That was indeed a considerable sum. And did Lady Bantry explain her reasons for making this bequest?" "She did not. And I confess, Miss Marple, that I found this rather troubling. Lady Bantry seemed, if I may say so, disturbed during her visit, as though she were acting under some form of compulsion." "Compulsion? Perhaps that is too strong a word. But she was not her usual decisive self. She seemed anxious, even frightened, though she was far too proud to admit it. When I questioned her about the wisdom of making such a large bequest to someone unknown to her family, she became quite sharp with me. What exactly did she say? Mr. Peters replaced his spectacles and met Miss Marple's gaze directly. She said that it was a debt long overdue and that some things must be paid for whether one wishes to or not. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. A debt long overdue. The words had an ominous ring to them, suggesting obligation tangled with guilt or fear. Tell me, Mr. Peters, did Lady Bantry seem as though she might be afraid for her safety? The solicitor's expression grew grave. I wondered the same thing myself, Miss Marple. In fact, I went so far as to ask her directly if she was being threatened in any way. She denied it, of course, but I did not entirely believe her. Chapter 8. If the garden that knows too much. The afternoon sun was warm on Miss Marple's shoulders. As she walked slowly through the gardens at Gossington Hall, she had returned, on the pretext of collecting a book that Lady Bantry had lent her some weeks ago, but her true purpose was rather different. Gardens, in Miss Marple's experience, had a way of revealing secrets that houses kept hidden, and gardeners, who spent their days in quiet observation of growing things, often noticed more than they realized. She found old Tom kneeling by the herbaceous border, his gnarled hands working with surprising gentleness among the delphiniums. He was a man of 70 if he was a day, with a face like weathered oak and eyes that were still sharp despite his years. He had been head gardener at Gossington Hall since before the Great War, and Miss Marple suspected that very little happened on the estate without his knowledge. He looked up as her shadow fell across the flower bed and rose slowly to his feet, touching his cap in respectful greeting. Miss Marple, good afternoon to you. Good afternoon, Tom. What beautiful delphiniums. You've quite outdone yourself this year. A flicker of pleasure crossed his weathered face. They've done well enough, Miss Marple. Her ladyship was particularly fond of the blue ones. She always said they reminded her of a summer sky. His use of the past tense struck Miss Marple as both touching and significant. Tom was already adjusting to a world without Lady Bantry in it. She had excellent taste. I wonder, Tom, might you spare me a few moments? I should very much like to walk through the rose garden, and I confess my knees are not what they once were. A strong arm would be most welcome. It was a small fiction designed to put the old man at ease, and Tom accepted it with the grave courtesy of his generation. He offered his arm, and together they walked slowly along the gravel path thatched toward the rose garden and the ornamental lake beyond. A terrible thing, her ladyship's passing, Tom said after a moment. Very sudden, they say. Very sudden indeed. Did you see Lady Bantry on the day she died? I did, Miss Marple. I saw her that morning when she came out to look at the roses. She was planning the arrangements for the church fete, you see, and wanted to know which varieties would be at their best in a fortnight's time, and she seemed well. Well enough. Miss Marple, though, he paused, frowning slightly. Yes? She seemed a bit preoccupied, if you take my meaning, not her usual self. He asked if the roses met with her approval, and she barely looked at them, just said they'd do well enough, and walked on toward the lake. They had reached the rose garden now, and Miss Marple paused to admire a particularly fine specimen of Madame Alfred Carrière climbing the old brick wall. The scent was heavenly, filling the air with its delicate perfume. The lake, she said thoughtfully. Did Lady Bantry often walk there? Not as often as she once did, Miss Marple. There were sad memories attached to the place, you see. Miss Marple's interests harpened, though her expression remained merely one of polite curiosity. Sad memories. Tom shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncertain whether he should continue. But Miss Marple had a way of inspiring confidences, and after a moment he went on. It was a long time ago, Miss Marple, before the last war, A young maid who worked at the house drowned there. Very tragic it was. How dreadful. Was it an accident? The coroner said so, Miss Marple. But there was talk, as there always is in such cases. The girl had been dismissed that very morning, you see, under what they called awkward circumstances. What sort of circumstances? Tom looked down at his boots, his discomfort evident. There was some business about Colonel Bantry, Miss Marple. Nothing serious, I'm sure, just foolish gossip. But her ladyship was very upset about it all, and the girl was let go without a character reference. They found her in the lake that evening. Miss Marple felt a cold finger of understanding touch her spine. A dismissed maid, a drowning, awkward circumstances involving Colonel Bantry. And now, all these years later, a mysterious Eleanora Cray receiving $10,000 from Lady Bantry's estate. Do you remember the girl's name, Tom? Cray, Miss Marple. Eleanora Cray. For a moment, Miss Marple could not speak. The pieces were beginning to fall into place with a clarity that was both illuminating and deeply troubling. You have an excellent memory, Tom. Some things stay with you, Miss Marple, particularly when there's sadness attached to them. Her ladyship never liked to speak of it afterward. And the colonel, well, he went off to France not long after, and came back changed, like so many did. They had reached the lake now, a small ornamental water surrounded by willows whose trailing branches dipped gracefully toward the surface. It was a peaceful spot, beautiful in its way. But Miss Marple found herself thinking of the young maid who had died here all those years ago. Tell me, Tom, has anyone else been asking about this sad history recently? Tom's expression changed, becoming more alert. Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, there was someone. Just the day before her ladyship passed, a woman came calling, claiming to be an old acquaintance. She asked particularly to see the lake, saying something about wanting to see where it happened. Where? What happened? She didn't say, Miss Marple, and I thought it an odd sort of question, but she seemed respectable enough, well-dressed and well-spoken, so I showed her the way. She stood by the water for a good 10 minutes, not saying a word, just looking. Can you describe her? Middle-aged Miss Marple, 50 or thereabouts, dark hair going gray, thin, with a sharp sort of face. She had the look of someone who had had a hard life, if you know what I mean. Miss Marple knew exactly what he meant. She had seen that look often enough in the village on the faces of women who had been disappointed or betrayed, or simply worn down by the difficulties of existence. Did this woman give her name? She did not. Miss Marple, though she mentioned that she and her ladyship were old friends. I did think it strange that her ladyship had never mentioned her before. Did you tell Lady Bantry about this visit? I did, Miss Marple, that same evening. Her ladyship went very pale and quiet when I described the woman. Then she thanked me and went back into the house. I could see she was troubled. They stood together in silence for a moment, looking at the peaceful water. A moorhen called from among the reeds, and somewhere in the willows a thrush was singing its evening song. Thank you, Tom, Miss Marple said at last. You have been most helpful. As she made her way back to the house, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. Eleanora Cray had not drowned in that lake all those years ago. She had survived, and after decades of silence, she had returned to Gossington Hall. And the very next day, Lady Bantry was dead. Chapter 6. The Maid's Mistake. Miss Marple had just settled herself in the morning room with a pot of tea when young Daisy appeared in the doorway. Her face flushed and her eyes red from weeping. The girl could not have been more than 19, with a sort of fresh country prettiness that would fade quickly under the weight of hard work and worry. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Clara said you wanted to see the sugar bowl when Dr. Haydock was finished with it. How very kind of you to remember, Daisy. Yes, I should very much like to see it. The girl came forward hesitantly, carrying a small tray on which rested the Georgian silver sugar bowl that had stood beside Lady Bantry's final cup of tea. Miss Marple noted that Daisy's hands trembled slightly, causing the spoon to rattle against the bowl. "Now, my dear, douse it down for a moment. You look quite done in." "Oh, I couldn't, Miss Marple. It wouldn't be proper." "Nonsense. I am not Lady Bantry, and I have always believed that kindness should take precedence over propriety. Please sit." Daisy perched on the edge of a chair, clearly uncomfortable, but too well trained to refuse a direct request. Miss Marple examined the sugar bowl with great care, tilting it toward the light from the window. The lumps inside were uniform, now all the same pristine white that fresh sugar should be. But her memory was clear. One of those lumps had been darker, as though dampened or discolored. "Tell me, Daisy, when you wash the tea things, do you also wash the sugar that was in the bowl?" The girl looked bewildered by the question. "Wash the sugar, Miss Marple? No, indeed. That would ruin it entirely. We empty the bowl and return any unused sugar to the canister." "I see. And the sugar that was in this bowl on the day Lady Bantry died, what became of that?" "Dr. Haydock took it away, Miss Marple. He said he wanted to examine it properly. Very particular he was, about not mixing it with anything else." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Dr. Haydock was proving to be admirably thorough. "And when did you refill the bowl?" "This morning, Miss Marple, when I was setting up for the family's breakfast, though, of course, there's no family here yet, with the Colonel still traveling and Miss Bantry not arriving until this evening." Miss Marple set the bowl down gently and turned her full attention to the young maid. "Daisy, I wonder if you might help me understand something. Clara tells me that she prepared the tea tray on the afternoon Lady Bantry died, using the sugar from the kitchen canister as always. Is that correct?" "Yes, Miss Marple, and yet I have reason to believe that the sugar bowl might have been brought from elsewhere in the house. The upstairs morning room, perhaps." Daisy's face went from pink to white in an instant, and her hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm that sorry. It was all my fault, you see. I've been that worried about it, wondering if I should say something. But Clara told me not to make a fuss when her ladyship had just passed and all." "Take your time, my dear. There is nothing to be frightened of. Just tell me exactly what happened." The girl drew a shaky breath. "It was that afternoon, Miss Marple. Clara had set up the tea tray in the kitchen, all proper and correct, but then Laura asked me to take some fresh flowers up to the morning room where the charity committee ladies had been meeting that morning. When I got there, I saw there were tea things left out on the table, and I thought I should bring them down to be washed." "Very conscientious of you." "Yes, Miss Marple, only I wasn't paying proper attention, was I? I picked up the sugar bowl from the morning room and brought it down with the cups and saucers, and when I got to the kitchen, I saw that Clara had already put a sugar bowl on her ladyship's tea tray. So I thought, well, one's as good as another, and I switched them." "You took the sugar bowl from Clara's tray and replaced it with the one from the morning room." "Yes, Miss Marple." Daisy was close to tears now. "And I never thought anything of it until after her ladyship died. And then I got to worrying. What if there was something wrong with that sugar? What if I killed her ladyship through my carelessness?" Miss Marple leaned forward and patted the girl's hand with warm sympathy. "My dear child, you must not blame yourself. If there was something wrong with that sugar, you were not the one who put it there. But who would do such a terrible thing, Miss Marple? That is precisely what we must discover. Now tell me about these charity committee ladies. Who were they?" Daisy wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "There were 4 of them, Miss Marple. Mrs. Carmichael from the church, Miss Weatherby, Mrs. Price from the village, and a lady I didn't recognize. A stranger. Like Miss Marple's pulse quickened. Can you describe this stranger? She was older, Miss Marple. 50 or so, I'd say. Thin, with dark hair going gray. She had a sharp sort of face, and she looked at everything very carefully as though she were taking inventory. The description matched perfectly with what Tom had told her about the woman who had visited the lake. And did this woman leave the morning room at any point during the meeting? Daisy's brow furrowed in concentration. Now that you mention it, Miss Marple, yes. She asked to use the facilities, and I directed her to the cloakroom, but that was a good 15 minutes before the meeting ended. Long enough to do a number of things, Miss Marple murmured. Miss Marple? Nothing, my dear, just thinking aloud. Tell me, did this woman bring anything with her? A handbag, perhaps, or a basket? She had a large handbag, Miss Marple. Black leather, very worn, and she kept it with her the whole time, even when she went to the cloakroom. Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out over the gardens, where Tom would be tending his beloved flowers. Her mind was assembling the pieces with increasing certainty. Eleanora Cray had not come to Gossington Hall, merely to look at the lake where she had supposedly drowned all those years ago. She had come with a purpose far more sinister. She had attended the charity committee meeting, knowing that Lady Bantry would not be present, but the tea would be served. And at some point she had adulterated the sugar in the bowl, perhaps mixing, in a substance that looked similar but was far from harmless. Then she had waited, knowing that Gossington's efficient servants would eventually bring that poison sugar to Lady Bantry's tea tray. But how could she have known that Daisy would make her innocent mistake, unless she had not known, and had planned something else entirely? Miss Marple turned back to Daisy, who sat watching her with anxious eyes. Did any of the committee ladies take sugar in their tea? Only Mrs. Price, Miss Marple. The others said they were watching their figures, and Mrs. Price suffered no ill effects. None that I know of, Miss Marple. So the poison had been concentrated in just 1 or 2 lumps, perhaps. Or perhaps it had been added to the bowl after the meeting had ended. Either way, Eleanora Cray had ensured that the deadly sugar would find its way to her intended victim. One more question, Daisy. When you collected the tea things from the morning room, was the sugar bowl empty or full? Nearly full, Miss Marple. The ladies had hardly touched it, and yet when you placed it on Lady Bantry's tray, it remained full. Yes, Daisy said. I didn't think to empty it first. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That explained why only 1 or 2 lumps had been darkened. Eleanora Cray had added her poison to a bowl already containing ordinary sugar, knowing that eventually those particular lumps would be used. It was clever in its way, almost clever enough to be mistaken for natural death, but not quite clever, enough to fool an elderly lady who noticed when sugar bowls had their lids replaced askew. Chapter 7. A visit from Dr. Haydock. Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as the church clock was striking 4. She'd been expecting him, having sent a carefully worded note that morning, suggesting he might find it useful to compare observations. The doctor looked tired, with deep lines etched around his eyes that had not been there a week ago. "Thank you for coming," Miss Marple said, ushering him into her sitting room. "I have taken the liberty of preparing tea." "Very kind of you, Miss Marple." He settled into the chair she indicated and accepted his cup with visible gratitude. "I must confess I am glad of the opportunity to speak with you privately. This business with Lady Bantry has been troubling me considerably. I had gathered as much from your manner at Gossington Hall. You have completed your examination of the tea things?" "I have." Dr. Haydock set down his cup and regarded her with a directness that she appreciated. "Miss Marple, I am going to speak frankly, in the knowledge that what I say will go no further without my permission. You have my word. Lady Bantry did not die of a stroke. She was poisoned. Although Miss Marple had suspected as much, hearing the confirmation spoken aloud still sent a chill through her. You're certain? Quite certain. The substance used was chloral hydrate, administered in a substantial dose. I found significant traces in the sugar that remained in the bowl, concentrated in two particular lumps. Chloral hydrate, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. That is a sedative, is it not? Indeed, in medicinal doses, it is used to treat insomnia and anxiety, but in large quantities it is quite lethal. It causes unconsciousness followed by respiratory failure. Death can occur within minutes. Miss Marple absorbed this information, her mind already making connections. Lady Bantry suffered from insomnia. I believe she mentioned it to me on several occasions. She did. I had prescribed chloral hydrate for her use on numerous occasions over the years, but I was always very careful about the dosage, and I made certain she understood the dangers of taking too much. And her supply of the medication? Where was it kept? Dr. Haydock's expression grew grimmer. That is one of the things that troubles me most. I visited Gossington Hall this morning to examine Lady Bantry's bedside table, where she customarily kept her medications. The bottle of chloral hydrate that I prescribed for her 3 weeks ago is missing. Missing entirely? Yes, and according to Laura, it was there on the morning of her death. He noticed it when he opened the curtains in her bedroom. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, looking out at her garden where the evening sun cast long shadows across the lawn. The pieces were falling into place with inexorable logic, though the picture they formed was deeply unpleasant. Dr. Haydock, I wonder if I might share with you certain information I have gathered over the past 2 days. Please do. I suspect you've been considerably more thorough in your inquiries than I have had. Time to be. Miss Marple returned to her chair and recounted everything she had learned from her conversation with Mr. Peters about the altered will to Tom's description of the woman who had visited the lake, and finally to Daisy's confession about switching the sugar bowls. Dr. Haydock listened with close attention, occasionally nodding or making a note in his pocketbook. Eleanora Cray, he said when she'd finished. The name is familiar, though I cannot quite place it. She was a housemaid at Gossington Hall many years ago. There was a scandal involving Colonel Bantry, and she was dismissed. Shortly afterward, she was believed to have drowned in the ornamental lake. Good God. And you believe this woman has returned after all these years? I'm quite certain of it. She attended the charity committee meeting the day before Lady Bantry's death, though she gave a false name. She had ample opportunity to adulterate the sugar bowl, knowing that the servants would eventually bring it to Lady Bantry, and she visited the lake the previous day, making certain that Lady Bantry knew she had returned. Dr. Haydock was silent for a long moment, his tea growing cold in his cup. But why go to such elaborate lengths? If she wished to confront Lady Bantry about the events of the past, surely a direct approach would have been more effective. I do not think Eleanora Cray wanted confrontation, Dr. Haydock. I think she wanted revenge, and revenge, particularly when it has been nursed for decades, can take very calculated forms. Yet Lady Bantry made that substantial bequest to her, 10,000. Surely that suggests some form of reconciliation. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I believe it suggests quite the opposite. I believe Eleanora Cray threatened Lady Bantry, perhaps with exposure of some old scandal. Lady Bantry, to protect her family's reputation, agreed to the bequest, but that was not enough for Miss Cray. Perhaps it had never been about money at all. Dr. Haydock rubbed his face wearily. This is a dreadful business, Miss Marple. If what you say is true, we are dealing with a woman who's spent years planning murder. I fear we are dealing with something even more complicated than that. More complicated? How so? Miss Marple hesitated, choosing her words with care. I found something at Gossington Hall yesterday, a half-burned letter in the drawing-room fireplace. It was addressed to someone with the initials EC, and the content was quite disturbing. What did it say? The exact wording escapes me, but the sentiment was clear. The writer claimed they could no longer live with what they knew and suggested that perhaps the recipient should not live either. Dr. Haydock's expression changed. Are you suggesting that Lady Bantry wrote that letter? I am suggesting it is a possibility. And if she did write it, what does that tell us about her state of mind on the day she died? The doctor was silent, clearly working through the implications. You think Lady Bantry knew the sugar was poisoned? I think it is possible. Consider the facts, Dr. Haydock. The visitor, who supposedly came to call, was never seen arriving or departing. Only one teacup was used, though two had been poured, and Lady Bantry was found sitting peacefully in her chair with no sign of alarm or distress, as though she'd expected it, Dr. Haydock said slowly. Or as though she had chosen it. Lady Bantry was a proud woman. If she believed that scandal was about to engulf her family, might she not have preferred to remove herself from the equation entirely? But the poisoned sugar came from the morning room, brought there by Eleanora Cray. How could Lady Bantry have known about it? Perhaps she did not know the specific method, but she knew Eleanora Cray had returned with malicious intent. She had changed her will, clearly under some form of duress. She had burned a letter that suggested she was contemplating desperate measures, and then, when Clara brought the tea tray, perhaps Lady Bantry recognized something about that sugar bowl, something that told her it had not come from the usual source. Dr. Haydock sat down his cup with trembling hands. You're suggesting that Lady Bantry deliberately consumed poison to protect their family from scandal. That is a terrible thought. It is indeed. But I have known many women like Lady Bantry over the years. Dr. Haydock, women of a certain generation and class, who believed that family honor was more important than individual happiness. Women who would rather die than see their loved ones shamed. They sat in silence as dusk gathered in the corners of the room. Finally, Dr. Haydock spoke. What do you propose we do with this information? Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. I propose we find Eleanora Cray before anyone else dies. Chapter 8. The Silver Spoon. Inspector Slack arrived at Gossington Hall the following morning with the sort of determined efficiency that characterized all his actions. He was a large, red-faced man who had served as the local inspector for 15 years, and who had never entirely forgiven Miss Marple for solving several cases that had initially baffled him. Nevertheless, he respected her judgment, even if he would never admit it aloud. Miss Marple had telephoned him the previous evening after Dr. Haydock had departed. The conversation had been brief and to the point. Dr. Haydock had confirmed poisoning. She had information that might prove relevant, and would the inspector care to meet her at Gossington Hall to discuss the matter? Inspector Slack had cared very much indeed. Now they stood together in the drawing room, the scene of Lady Bantry's death, while Laura hovered anxiously near the door. The tea service had been returned to its usual place in the china cabinet, but Miss Marple had asked that it be brought out again for examination. Now then, Miss Marple, Inspector Slack said, his notebook at the ready. Dr. Haydock tells me you've been making inquiries. Perhaps you'd care to share what you've discovered. Miss Marple did so, recounting the same information she had given the doctor, though she was careful to present it as observation rather than conclusion. Inspector Slack listened with increasing attention, his pencil moving rapidly across the page. This Eleanora Cray woman. We'll need to locate her immediately. Do we have any idea where she might be staying? Tom mentioned that she arrived on foot from the direction of the village, Miss Marple said. There are only two places in St. Mary Mead where a stranger might take lodgings, the Blue Boar and Mrs. Kimball's boarding house on the High Street. Right, I'll send Constable Pole to make inquiries. He turned to Laura. This charity committee meeting, I'll need the names of all the ladies who attended. Laura provided the information with his usual precision, and Inspector Slack made careful notes. Now then, the inspector said, turning his attention to the tea service that Clara had arranged on the low table. You mentioned something about a teaspoon, Miss Marple. Yes, indeed. If you look closely at the spoons, Inspector, you will notice that one of them appears to have been polished more recently than the others. Inspector Slack bent to examine the silver, his eyes narrowing. You're right. This one here is brighter, like it's been given an extra rub. Precisely. And if you look even more closely, you will see that while the other spoons retain faint traces of sugar crystals in the decorative grooves, this particular spoon is completely clean. The inspector straightened, his expression thoughtful, as though someone wiped it very thoroughly after using it. That would be my interpretation. I asked Laura about the arrangement of the tea tray, and he told me something rather interesting. She turned to the butler, who stepped forward reluctantly. Tell the inspector what you told me, Laura, about who served the tea. Laura cleared his throat. The visitor inspector, the lady who supposedly came to call on her ladyship, she asked if she might pour the tea herself, saying that old friends should not stand on ceremony. Did she know? Inspector Slack muttered. And you didn't think that was odd? At the time, Inspector, no. It seemed a natural enough request. It was only afterward, when I began to think about the whole affair, that I realized I had never actually seen this visitor. I took the request at face value because Clara told me about it, but Clara herself never saw the woman either. Miss Marple interjected gently. I believe what happened is this. Eleanora Cray did come to Gossington Hall that afternoon, but she did not ring the front bell or present herself in the normal way. She came through the garden door, which Lady Bantry often left unlocked. She entered the drawing room where Lady Bantry was waiting. Having arranged the meeting in advance through some form of communication we have not yet discovered. The letters from London, Inspector Slack said, consulting his notes. The postmistress mentioned them. Quite so. Eleanora Cray wrote to Lady Bantry making her demands. Lady Bantry, perhaps hoping to reason with her, or perhaps knowing that resistance was futile, agreed to meet her. When Clara brought the tea tray, Lady Bantry sent her away, claiming that her visitor would arrive shortly, and that she would pour the tea herself. But the visitor was already there, Inspector Slack said slowly. I believe so. Hidden perhaps in the morning room or on the terrace. Eleanora Cray waited until the servants were safely in the kitchen, then entered the drawing room properly. She and Lady Bantry had their conversation, whatever it may have been, and then Eleanora Cray suggested they take tea together as a gesture of reconciliation. Miss Marple moved to the tea table and gestured to the pristine cup. Eleanora Cray poured tea into both cups, shedded milk and sugar to her own cup using the spoon that she later wiped so carefully, but she did not drink from that cup. Instead, she contrived to switch them so that Lady Bantry drank from the cup containing the poison sugar, while the clean cup remained untouched. How can you be certain the cups were switched? Inspector Slack asked. I cannot be entirely certain, Inspector. But consider if Eleanora Cray had simply wanted to poison Lady Bantry, she need only have ensured the sugar was in her cup. Why go to the elaborate trouble of pouring 2 cups at all, unless she wanted to create the appearance that she herself had taken tea, thereby establishing that she could not have been responsible for any poisoning, because a woman who drinks from the same teapot cannot be accused of putting poison in it, the inspector said. Exactly. It is a classic misdirection. Eleanora Cray wanted it to appear that she had taken tea with Lady Bantry and departed safely, leaving Lady Bantry to die alone. But she made 2 mistakes. First, she wiped the spoon too thoroughly, removing all traces of sugar when a spoon naturally used would retain some. And second, she did not account for the fact that Lady Bantry wore lipstick. Inspector Slack looked at the used cup, then at Miss Marple with dawning comprehension. The lipstick mark is in the wrong place. I thought so when I first saw it, though I could not immediately identify why it troubled me. Lady Bantry always drank from the same position on a cup, leaving a mark at approximately 2 o'clock if one imagines the cup as a clock face. But the mark on this cup is at 10 o'clock. Meaning someone else drank from it first, then turned it so the mark would be in a different position when Lady Bantry used it. Or, Miss Marple said quietly, meaning the cups were switched after the tea was poured, and Eleanora Cray did not realize that the lipstick mark would betray her deception. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. Right. We need to find this woman immediately. If she's killed once, there's nothing to stop her from disappearing, or, God forbid, trying again with someone else. He turned to Laura. No one is to touch anything in this room until I return, and I want a list of everyone who had access to Lady Bantry's bedroom on the day she died. Very good. Inspector. As they left the drawing room, Miss Marple found herself thinking not of Eleanora Cray's cleverness, but of her hatred. To plan a murder with such meticulous attention to detail required not just intelligence, but a depth of bitterness that must have consumed years of her life. What had happened in this house all those decades ago that could inspire such terrible revenge? Chapter 9. The Memory in the Mirror. The Blue Boar yielded no information about Eleanora Cray, but Mrs. Kimball's boarding house proved more fruitful. A woman matching the description had indeed taken a room there 4 days ago, giving her name as Mrs. Ellen Gray, with an A. She had paid a week in advance and kept largely to herself, going out each day, but always returning before dark. A quiet sort of person, Mrs. Kimball told Inspector Slack and Miss Marple in her cluttered parlor. Respectable, I thought, though there was something sad about her, as though she'd had troubles in her life. Is she here now? Inspector Slack asked. No, Inspector. She went out early this morning with her bag and hasn't returned. I assume she'd gone to catch a train, though she'd paid through the end of the week. May we see her room? Mrs. Kimball led them upstairs to a small but clean chamber overlooking the street. It was evident that Eleanora Cray had left in haste. Drawers stood partly open, and several items of clothing had been abandoned in the wardrobe. On the dressing table, Miss Marple noticed a few toiletries, and more significantly, a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. She picked it up carefully, studying the faded image. It showed a young woman of perhaps 20, pretty in a delicate way, standing beside a man in military uniform. The photograph had been taken in the garden at Gossington Hall. Miss Marple recognized the rose arbor in the background. May I borrow this, Mrs. Kimball? I promise it will be returned. Of course, Miss Marple, though I can't think what use it will be. Inspector Slack was examining the contents of the wastepaper basket. He extracted several crumpled papers, smoothing them out on the dressing table. Most were false starts at letters, the writing increasingly agitated and difficult to read. But one fragment caught Miss Marple's attention. You ruined my life, it read. You took everything from me. My position, my reputation, my chance at happiness. You believed his lies instead of my truth. Now you will understand what it means to lose everything. Inspector Slack's face was grim. This is as good as a confession. We need to find her before she does something else foolish. As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple's mind was working through the fragments of the old scandal, trying to piece together what had really happened all those years ago. A young maid, pretty and vulnerable, Colonel Bantry, returned from war and perhaps not entirely stable. Lady Bantry protective of her husband and her marriage. Accusations, dismissal, shame. But what had been the truth of it? She voiced this question as they walked back toward the village center. Inspector, do you recall the Bantry scandal? It would have been just after the Great War. Inspector Slack frowned. Before my time in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple. But I've heard references to it over the years. Something about an improper relationship between Colonel Bantry and a servant. I wonder if anyone remembers the actual details. So much of what we think we know about the past is merely village gossip, embroidered and altered with each retelling. Are you suggesting the girl was innocent? I am suggesting that the truth may be more complicated than a simple story of seduction or accusation. Eleanora Cray has harbored this grudge for 30 years, Inspector. That suggests a wound that never healed. They found Tom in his potting shed mixing compost with the methodical care of long practice. He looked up as they entered, unsurprised by their visit. I thought you might come, Miss Marple. I've been thinking about what we discussed, and there's more I should have told you about Eleanora Cray, about what really happened. Tom set down his trowel and wiped his hands on his apron, his weathered face troubled. I was a young man then, just started as Gardener. Eleanora Cray was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen, and sweet-natured with it. She'd been at Gossington Hall for 2 years, and everyone liked her. Then Colonel Bantry came back from France. He was different after the war, Miss Marple, she prompted gently. He was broken, Miss Marple. What they called shell-shocked. He had nightmares, terrible rages. Lady Bantry did her best, but she couldn't help him. Eleanora was kind to him. She was kind to everyone. She'd sit with him when he was in one of his black moods, reading to him or just keeping him company. There was nothing improper in it. I'd swear to that. She was trying to help, but Lady Bantry misunderstood. More than that, Miss Marple. Colonel Bantry became attached to Eleanora in a way that wasn't quite right. Not improper, but dependent. He'd ask for her constantly, wouldn't settle unless she was there. And one day Lady Bantry found them together in the library. The colonel was weeping like a child, and Eleanora was holding his hand, trying to comfort him. Inspector Slack shifted uncomfortably. Lady Bantry assumed the worst. She did, Inspector. And when Eleanora tried to explain, Lady Bantry wouldn't listen. She dismissed the girl that very day with no character reference and no wages owing. Told her she was never to speak of what had happened, or she'd see to it that Eleanora never found decent work. Again. And Eleanora went to the lake, Miss Marple said softly. Tom's eyes were distant, remembering. They found her clothing on the bank, but no body. The lake connects to the river through an underground channel, so everyone assumed she'd drowned and been carried away. There was an inquest, a verdict of suicide, while the balance of the mind was disturbed, and that was the end. Off it. Except that Eleanora Cray didn't die, Inspector Slack said. No, Inspector. She survived somehow, and all these years she's been living with the injustice of it. Miss Marple looked at the photograph she still carried. Who is the man in this picture, Tom? Is it Colonel Bantry? Tom glanced at it and shook his head. That's Eleanora's young man, Miss Marple. Robert Shaw, his name was, a lieutenant in the same regiment as Colonel Bantry. He was killed at Passchendaele in 1917. Eleanora kept his picture with her always. She'd been waiting for him to come home so they could marry. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. Eleanora Cray had lost her fiancé to the war. She had tried to help another damaged soldier, showing him the kindness she would have wanted someone to show Robert. And for that kindness she had been accused, dismissed, and driven to such despair that everyone believed she had taken her own life. 30 years of bitterness. 30 years of wanting the world to understand what had been done to her. Inspector, Miss Marple said urgently, we must return to Gossington Hall immediately. Why? What have you realized? Eleanora Cray didn't come here merely to kill Lady Bantry. She came to make her understand, to force her to acknowledge the injustice, and I very much fear that Lady Bantry did understand in the end. Perhaps too well. Chapter 10. Truth at Gossington Hall. They found Eleanora Cray in the garden at Gossington Hall. sitting on the stone bench beside the ornamental lake. She was a thin woman dressed in shabby black, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely from a face that might once have been pretty, but was now lined with years of hardship and grief. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, gazing at the water with an expression of profound weariness. Inspector Slack approached cautiously, but Eleanor Cray made no move to flee. She simply turned her head and looked at them with eyes that held neither fear nor defiance, only a terrible emptiness. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said quietly. "I've been waiting here trying to decide what to do next." "Miss Cray," Inspector Slack began, his voice formal, "I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Lady Bantry. I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence against you." Eleanor Cray smiled faintly, thought there was no humor in it. Murder. Yes, I suppose that is what it was, though it feels more complicated than that simple word suggests. Miss Marple moved forward slowly, settling herself on the bench beside the other woman. Inspector Slack looked as though he might object, but something in Miss Marple's expression stopped him. "You have carried this burden for a very long time," Miss Marple said gently. 30 years, Miss Marple. I know who you are. Lady Bantry spoke of you often in her letters. She said you were the cleverest woman in St. Mary Mead, that nothing escaped your notice." "Lady Bantry wrote to you?" "Not willingly. I wrote to her first, 3 months ago. I told her I was still alive, and that I had never forgotten what she did to me. I told her about the years I spent working in factories, the poverty, the loneliness. I told her how I'd been forced to give up any hope of respectability because I had no character reference, no past that I could acknowledge." Eleanor Cray's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. She wrote back, "I was surprised by that. She said she had always felt guilty about what happened, that she'd acted in haste and perhaps in jealousy. She said she wanted to make amends." "The bequest in her will," Miss Marple said. "Yes, 10,000, as though money could repair what was broken." Eleanor Cray's voice hardened, but I did not want her money. I wanted her to admit what she had done. I wanted her to tell the truth, to acknowledge that she had ruined an innocent woman's life, because she was too proud to see what was really happening with her husband. "So, you came here," Inspector Slack said. "I came here. I told her I would expose everything unless she made a public confession. I wanted the whole village to know what kind of woman she really was. But Lady Bantry refused. She said she would not shame her family, that the past should remain buried." Eleanor Cray turned her gaze back to the lake, her expression distant. "I was so angry. All those years of suffering, and she still cared more about her precious reputation than about justice. So I decided that if she would not tell the truth willingly, I would force her hand." "You attended the charity committee meeting," Miss Marple said. "You brought powdered chloral hydrate with you and mixed it into the sugar bowl." "I took the bottle from her bedside table the day before when I came to look at the lake. The garden door was unlocked, as it always used to be. I went upstairs while the servants were occupied. It was almost too easy." "You knew about the medication because Lady Bantry mentioned her insomnia in one of her letters," Miss Marple continued, piecing it together. "She complained about many things in those letters: her health, her worries about the colonel, her difficulties sleeping. She never realized she was giving me exactly what I needed." Inspector Slack's expression was stern. "You deliberately poisoned the sugar, knowing it would find its way to Lady Bantry. I knew the servants' routines. I knew that tea things left in the morning room would eventually be collected and used elsewhere. It was simply a matter of patience." "But something went wrong," Miss Marple said softly. "Lady Bantry knew, didn't she? She knew what you had done." Eleanor Cray's composure finally cracked, and tears began to slide down her weathered cheeks. "She telephoned me at the boarding house that afternoon. She said she had seen me at the committee meeting, recognized me despite the years. She said she knew I had taken her medication and understood what I intended. She asked me to come to Gossington Hall to talk one final time. And you went? I went. I arrived through the garden door as she instructed. She was in the drawing room, and the tea tray had already been brought in. She looked so old, Miss Marple, so tired. And she said the most extraordinary thing. Eleanora Cray wiped her eyes with a worn handkerchief. She said she was sorry that she had been wrong all those years ago, that she had let fear and pride blind her to the truth. She said she'd known for years that I was innocent, that her husband had told her so before he died, but she'd been too ashamed to make amends. And then she said that she could not live with the guilt any longer. Miss Marple felt a deep sadness settle over her. She knew about the poison sugar. She knew. She told me that she deserved to die for what she had done to me, and that her death would spare her family the scandal it threatened. She poured tea into both cups, added sugar to her own, and drank it while I watched. She said it was the least she could do, to take the burden of murder from my hands. The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the gentle sound of water lapping against the stone edge of the lake. A blackbird sang in the willows, unaware of the human tragedy unfolding beneath its perch. "Did you try to stop her?" Inspector Slack asked, his voice less harsh than before. "I did, I truly did. But she was already drinking when I realized what she meant to do. And then it was too late." She sat back in her chair and closed her eyes, and within minutes she was gone. Eleanora Cray turned to look directly at Miss Marple. "I am a murderer, Miss Marple. Even if my hand did not directly administer the poison, I created the circumstances. I intended the death. The fact that Lady Bantry chose to drink the tea herself does not absolve me." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "It does not. But it does complicate the question of justice considerably." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Miss Cray, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. There will be questions, formal statements to be made." Eleanora Cray rose slowly with the stiff movements of someone much older than her years. From her pocket she withdrew a sealed envelope. "I wrote this last night when I realized I could not run from what I had done. It contains a full confession. I have also written to my solicitor, leaving what little I have to a charity that helps young women in distressed circumstances. Perhaps some good can come from this miserable business." As Inspector Slack led her away, Miss Marple remained on the bench looking at the peaceful water where Eleanora Cray had supposedly drowned 30 decades ago. How many lives had been ruined by that one moment of misjudgment all those years past? Eleanora Cray, certainly, but also Lady Bantry, who had lived with guilt and shame for so long. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room at Gossington Hall, at Lady Bantry's particular invitation, conveyed through Laura before her death. The butler brought in the Georgian tea service, now thoroughly cleaned and polished, and arranged it on the low table. Miss Marple poured herself a single cup, adding milk, but no sugar. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 5, Lady Bantry's customary tea hour. The house was quiet, waiting for Colonel Bantry and his daughter to arrive and begin the difficult process of mourning and moving forward. Miss Marple thought about the two women whose lives had intersected so catastrophically. Both had suffered. Both had made choices that led inexorably to tragedy. And in the end, Lady Bantry had chosen to drink from a poisoned cup rather than allow another woman to bear the full weight of murder. "Even the kindest hearts," Miss Marple murmured to the empty room, "must sometimes drink sorrow to keep love untarnished." It was not quite true, she reflected. Lady Bantry had drunk not to protect love, but to protect reputation, to spare her family shame. Yet perhaps, in her final moments, she had also drunk to offer Eleanora Cray, a strange kind of mercy, to acknowledge, at last, the debt that could never be fully repaid. The village would speak kindly of Lady Bantry's peaceful passing. The inquest would reveal the poisoning, but Eleanora Cray's confession would make it clear that Lady Bantry had been both victim and willing participant in her own death. The scandal Eleanora had threatened would emerge after all, but it would be tempered by sympathy for a woman who had tried too late to atone for an old injustice. As for Eleanora Cray, she would face trial, though Miss Marple suspected that a jury might show some leniency given the peculiar circumstances. 30 years was a long time to carry bitterness, but it was also a long time to suffer unjustly. Missy Marple finished her tea and set down the cup. Tomorrow she would return to her cottage and her garden, to the comfortable routines of village life, but she would not forget Lady Bantry, or the lesson her death had taught about the long shadows cast by pride and fear. The clock chimed the half-hour, and somewhere in the house a door closed softly. Miss Marple rose, collected her gloves and handbag, and made her way quietly out into the gathering dusk.